Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in places where something terrible is about to happen. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room or the peaceful quiet of a world at rest. This is a different kind. The silence of a held breath. The silence before a door opens that can never be closed again. The Imperium of man had known war for 10,000 years. 10,000 years of grinding, relentless, never-ending conflict across a million worlds, scattered like embers across the dark of the galaxy. They had fought greenskin raiders, whose war cries shook the very sky, and whose sheer animal joy in destruction made them almost impossible to reason with. They had fought the ancient biting cold of the Necrons, stirring in their tomb worlds like a civilization-sized nightmare, dragging itself back from oblivion. They had fought the elegant, sorrowful cruelty of the Aeldari, those ancient people who watched humanity stumble across the stars with a mixture of contempt and grief. They had fought their own kind, turned traitor and corrupt, seduced by promises whispered from the dark places of the universe. They had fought demons, literal incarnations of human fear and desire and hatred, spilling into reality from a realm that had no right to exist in the first place. And somehow, through all of that, the Imperium endured. It bled, it shrank, it sometimes crumbled at its edges, and it always paid a terrible price. But it endured. 10,000 years of endurance is something, even if the thing you are enduring looks a lot like slow suffocation. By the middle of the 41st millennium, as the Imperium had settled into something that might generously be called a rhythm, the rhythm of crisis, sacrifice, and survival, wars erupted and were fought with the dull certainty of inevitability. Worlds burned, heroes died, and new heroes were raised up to take their place. The Imperial Guard, those countless millions of ordinary human beings, pressed into service for causes larger than any individual life could comprehend, formed the grinding backbone of this endless resistance. The Space Marines, those transhuman warriors who carried the genetic inheritance of the Emperor's own vision into every battle, remained the Imperium's sharpest weapon. The Inquisition watched and judged, and acted in ways that most people preferred not to think about too carefully. There was suffering in the Imperium, enormous and systemic suffering, yet the kind baked into the architecture of the institution itself. But there was also something that might be recognized as home, as civilization. The hive cities rose like mountains of iron and steel, and humanity into alien skies. The agri-worlds stretched their cultivated fields toward distant suns. The forge worlds pulsed with industry, hot and eternal, and devoted to the production of the tools that war required. The shrine worlds gleamed with the accumulated devotion of countless generations who had knelt in the light of stained glass and whispered prayers to a man who had long since passed beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. This was the galaxy, as humanity knew it, in the early 700s of the 41st millennium, a place of incredible darkness and occasional light. A place of suffering made bearable by the bonds between people, by faith, by the grim pride of those who had survived things that should have broken them. It was not a good world, not by any reasonable measure. But it was a known world, a world whose dangers had names and shapes and histories, a world where the worst things you could imagine were at least things you had already imagined. The Eastern Fringe occupied a particular place in that world, or rather, a particular absence of one. Sit with that geography for a moment, because it matters. The Milky Way galaxy is roughly 100,000 light-years across. Terra, humanity's birthplace and the seat of the Imperium, sits roughly 25,000 light-years from the galactic center, oriented toward what navigators call the galactic west. The Astronomicon, that great psychic beacon projected by the Emperor, reaches outward from Terra across approximately 50,000 light-years of space. It is an extraordinary range by any measure, but it does not cover everything. The extreme eastern edge of the galaxy, the region that eventually got named the Eastern Fringe, sits at the very outer limit of the Astronomican's reach, or beyond it entirely. Out there, the light of the Great Beacon is dim and intermittent and unreliable. What that means in practical terms is that the eastern fringe is genuinely difficult to reach, difficult to navigate, and difficult to hold. Imperial worlds, there are more isolated than their counterparts in the better-lit regions closer to Terra. Supply lines are longer and more fragile. Communication is slower and less reliable. Reinforcements, when a world needs them, must take longer to arrive and are less certain to appear at all. The worlds of the Eastern Fringe have always known themselves to be on the edge of things, the furthest extent of what the Imperium can effectively project itself, the place where the rules that govern more central systems are enforced more loosely, and the dangers of the galaxy press a little more closely against the windows. This is relevant because it shaped how the warning signs were received when they finally started to appear. Strange reports from the Eastern Fringe were not treated with the same urgency as strange reports from, say, the worlds of Ultramar or the well-documented systems of the Segmentum Solar. The Eastern Fringe was expected to be strange. It was expected to produce unusual findings, because the unusual was more common out there than the ordinary. And so when the reports began to describe worlds that had gone dark in unusual ways, the institutional reflex was to file those reports rather than to act on them immediately. Nobody had imagined the Tyranids, not because the warning signs weren't there. They were there, scattered across the historical record like breadcrumbs that nobody had bothered to follow. The Ordo Xenos, those particular members of the Inquisition devoted to the study and destruction of alien threats, had been quietly compiling strange data for centuries. Reports from the Eastern Fringe kept describing worlds that had gone dark in ways that didn't fit any established pattern. Not the slow silence of worlds lost to rebellion or plague or natural disaster. Something faster, something total. But the Imperium is large, and its bureaucratic machinery is slow, and information moves through that apparatus at the pace of ships through the warp, which is to say, erratically, and sometimes not at all. The Eastern Fringe was distant. The dead worlds out there were inconvenient mysteries, not yet classified as evidence of something approaching. The reports piled up in the archives of the Ordo Xenos and gathered the digital equivalent of dust, waiting for someone smart enough and dogged enough, and perhaps just unlucky enough to connect them into a picture that nobody was going to want to see. There is also something worth saying about the specific flavor of complacency that had settled over the Imperium in this period. By the mid-700s of the 41st millennium, the Imperium had been fighting more or less continuously for 10,000 years. The people who staffed its bureaucracies, who reviewed its intelligence reports, who made the decisions about where to direct resources and attention, were people who lived inside a civilization that had been in perpetual crisis for so long that crisis had become the background condition. Genuine surprise was rare. The range of threats was well established. You could point at a map of the galaxy and name the things that were going to try to kill you in each region, roughly. The Orcs were there, the Aeldari over there, the Necrons in those tomb worlds, the forces of chaos pressing always from within. The catalogue of dangers was frightening, but it was also, in a grim way, complete, familiar. The darkness that people knew how to navigate. Nobody had updated the catalogue. Nobody had left room in it for something that arrived from outside the galaxy entirely, was from outside the framework of any threat that had ever been encountered before. The institutional imagination of the Imperium was very good at identifying and responding to things it had seen before, or variations on things it had seen before. It was genuinely, structurally unprepared for something entirely new. Meanwhile, life in the Imperium continued. People were born and lived and died in the service of a civilization they understood mostly through the lens of immediate necessity. They did not think about the Eastern Fringe because the Eastern Fringe did not impinge on their lives. They did not think about dead worlds because dead worlds were someone else's problem. They could not have known that something was moving through the intergalactic dark. and something ancient and vast and driven by a hunger so absolute that it made every other threat the galaxy had ever produced look almost reasonable by comparison. They could not have known, and so they lived as they had always lived, and the silence gathered at the edge of things, and the breadth of the galaxy turned slowly on its axis, and somewhere out, in the long dark, between the stars, the first tendrils of what would later be named Behemoth were beginning their descent. The contact was coming, and when it came, it would change everything. Section 2. What are the Tyranids? The Great Devourer explained. Before we can understand what happened when humanity first encountered the Tyranids, we need to sit with the question of what the Tyranids actually are, not in the clinical sense of a biological taxonomy, but in the deeper sense that asks what kind of thing they represent. Because the Tyranids are not, at their core, something that fits neatly into the categories that the Imperium had developed for understanding alien threats. They are not conquerors. They do not want to rule the worlds they consume. They do not want worship or tribute or the satisfaction of domination. They do not hold grudges or negotiate or retreat in the face of superior opposition in order to come back with a better plan. Every alien civilization that the Imperium had dealt with before the Tyranids existed, in some capacity, on a spectrum of intelligibility. Even the most violent, even the most alien, was doing something recognizable. Trying to survive, trying to expand, trying to worship, trying to destroy what they feared or hated. The Tyranids are doing something else entirely. They are feeding. The entire Tyranid species, every creature that wears their chitin and moves to the beat of their psychic command, exists as a component of a single, vast organism. Not metaphorically. Literally, the hive mind, that terrible gestalt consciousness that spans light years and encompasses trillions of individual biological components, is the Tyranid species in its entirety. Each individual creature, from the smallest ripper swarm scuttling through the ruins of a fallen city to the colossal bioships that blot out the stars in their passage, is nothing more than a specialized cell in the body of something so enormously complex that most imperial scholars who have tried to comprehend it have come away either mad or deeply, quietly changed. Then there is no individual consciousness in a Tyranid creature. There is no self, no memory, no personality that persists independently of the hive mind's direction. When you look into the compound eyes of a hormigaunt, one of those fast, blade-limbed creatures that form the expendable shock troops of the swarm, there is nothing looking back that recognizes you as anything other than a source of biomass. When a Carnifex, that monstrous, hulking engine of biological destruction, crashes through a defense line, it is not angry. It is not triumphant. It is simply an organ performing its function, as inevitable and impersonal as a heartbeat. The hive mind itself, though, is something different, something vast and old, and in its own way deeply, horribly intelligent. The hive mind does not think the way a human being thinks, and it does not experience curiosity or wonder or the kind of tactical creativity that comes from individual officers operating with initiative and ingenuity. What it has instead is something that might be better described as biological intuition on a galactic scale. It learns from every encounter. Every time a Tyranid creature is killed in a particular way, the hive mind absorbs that information. Every piece of genetic material consumed from every world the swarm devours gets incorporated into the evolving genetic library that the hive mind uses to design and refine its bioforms. The Tyranids that attack the second world are already slightly better at attacking worlds than the Tyranids that attacked the first one. And the Tyranids that attack the 100th world are terrifyingly well suited to the task. This is the aspect of the Tyranid threat that haunts every serious military planner in the Imperium. Not just that they are a vast and devastating force, though they certainly are. It's that they improve. They adapt in real time, across individual battles, across campaigns, across the centuries. Every victory humanity wins against the Tyranids teaches the Tyranids something. Every defensive strategy, every weapon system, every tactic that works against them once will work less well the second time, and might not work at all the third time. Fighting the Tyranids is like trying to outthink a vast and hungry process of evolution, operating at a speed that natural selection could never achieve, directed by an intelligence that does not sleep or despair or run out of ideas. Or the individual bioforms that make up a Tyranid swarm are themselves extraordinary feats of biological engineering. The Tyranids do not build anything. They grow everything. Their warships are living creatures, enormous and impossible biovessels that drift through the void of space like nightmares made flesh, housing the organic mechanisms of propulsion and weapon systems and the reproductive apparatus that generates the smaller creatures the hive fleet deploys. Inside those hive ships, in vast organic chambers that pulse with wet biological heat, the most important Tyranid creatures of all lurk in the deepest protected spaces. The Norn Queens. These immense, extraordinarily intelligent creatures are the mothers of the swarm, and they are the biological architects who receive the genetic templates from the hive mind and birth the specific creatures the current campaign requires. Kill a Norn Queen, and the hive fleet loses its ability to reproduce and replenish. The Tyranids know this and protect their Norn Queens accordingly, at the absolute center of their most defended vessels. The hive fleet itself moves through space in a way that has no mechanical equivalent. There is a creature called the narval, a specialized organism that effectively functions as the hive fleet's faster-than-light propulsion mechanism. The narval manipulates the gravitational fields of the star systems it is aimed toward, using them to pull the fleet through space at speeds that should not be achievable by objects of the mass involved. This means that a Tyranid hive fleet does not need to travel through the warp. It does not need the Imperium at all for its physical movement between stars. It simply folds space around itself through gravity manipulation, and the stars come to it. The strategic implication of this is significant. The typical Imperial countermeasures against naval threats, things designed to disrupt warp travel or close warp routes, are simply irrelevant to the Tyranid advance. You cannot mine a warp lane against something that doesn't use warp lanes. The ground forces that a hive fleet deploys are enormously varied. At the bottom of the scale, the smallest creatures in the swarm sit the Rippers. Those tiny, worm-like organisms that function as the cleanup crew, stripping the last molecular traces of biomass from terrain that the larger creatures have already swept through. A Ripper is not threatening individually. In the numbers that a hive fleet deploys them, covering a landscape in a writhing living carpet that devours everything it contacts, they are as final as death. Above the Rippers come the Termagants and Hormagaunts, the basic infantry of the swarm. Fast, numerous, armed with either ranged bioweapons or close combat blades that emerge from their forearms. They die in enormous numbers against even modest Imperial firepower, but they are replaced in enormous numbers, and the swarm does not stop for its losses the way a human army stops. Losses in the Tyranid swarm are simply absorbed, the biomass of the dead folded back into the hive fleet's nutrient cycle. Further up the scale come the Tyranid warriors, those synapse creatures that serve as the neural relay points for the hive mind's control. Where a swarm of termagants operates largely on instinct when cut off from synapse direction, a brood of warriors carries the hive mind's will directly, directing the lesser creatures around them with the focused intelligence of the central consciousness. Kill the warriors, and the creatures around them begin to lose coherence. They become dangerous animals rather than directed soldiers, which is still lethal but qualitatively different. The importance of targeting synapse creatures was one of the most important tactical lessons the Imperium learned from the First Tyrannic War, and it is a lesson that was written in the blood of Macragge. And then there are the larger creatures, the Carnifex, behind that monstrous bio-engine of destruction that functions as the swarm's living siege weapon, capable of tearing through armored vehicles with forelimbs that have been grown specifically for the purpose of destroying heavily reinforced targets. The Hive Tyrant, enormous and intelligent and directly linked to the hive mind in a way that makes it both the most tactically capable creature on the battlefield and the most dangerous if allowed to operate with freedom of movement. The lictor, an assassin organism that moves with terrifying stealth and exists specifically to hunt command personnel and isolated groups, appearing from ambush in ways that produce a particular kind of psychological damage in any force that encounters them repeatedly. Each of these creatures is not designed, not in the way that a human engineer designs a weapon by drawing plans and manufacturing components. They are grown, shaped by the hive mind's direction of the Norn Queen's reproductive processes, refined over the course of invasion after invasion by the incorporation of genetic material from prey species and the iterative adaptation of forms that proved effective. The result is a biological weapons system of such comprehensive sophistication that the Adeptus Mechanicus xenobiologists, who have spent careers studying Tyranid anatomy, consistently describe the experience as humbling. Every component of every bioform is optimized. Every organ serves a purpose. Every adaptation has a reason behind it that, once understood, reveals a logic so thorough that it is almost admirable, in the way that very dangerous things sometimes reveal a terrible kind of beauty when you examine them closely enough. The way a Tyranid invasion proceeds is methodical in a way that only becomes apparent after the fact, when you survive to look back at what happened. The first stage is almost invisible. Vanguard organisms, things like genestealers and lictors, move ahead of the main fleet. The genestealers infiltrate inhabited worlds, infecting the local population with their biological touch and establishing what will eventually become a genestealer cult, a hidden society of hybrid creatures who look human enough to move through imperial society undetected, working to weaken their world's defenses from the inside. The lictors, those invisible horror show creatures with their hunting ability, move through the shadows of new worlds and compile biological and tactical assessments for the hive mind. There is something genuinely insidious about the genestealer cult that deserves a moment of attention, because it represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the Tyranid threat. A single genestealer, reaching an inhabited world, begins its work immediately. It infects individuals with its biological touch, implanting Tyranid genetic material that fundamentally rewrites the reproductive biology of its victims. The infected person does not immediately transform. They continue to look and function as a normal human being, or near enough. But when they have children, those children carry a genetic legacy that the genestealer has encoded in their parents' biology. The first generation of children born after infection are recognizably alien, with the domed heads and razor-sharp claws of their heritage, but subsequent generations trend back toward human appearance, until by the third or fourth generation from the original infection, the hybrids are indistinguishable from baseline humans unless subjected to careful biological examination. By this point, the cult has been building for generations. Its members are everywhere, in the work gangs of the hive city's lower levels, in the municipal administration offices, in the planetary defense forces. Some of them have never even met a genestealer and have only a vague sense of devotion to something they call their star father or their patriarch, as a religious impulse that feels genuine because the psychic influence of the cult's brood mind has shaped their consciousness from birth. They do not know that their devotion is a function of alien biology. They do not know that the God they serve intends to consume them. They know only that when the call comes, when the signal from their shared consciousness rises to a pitch that cannot be ignored, they will rise. And they will rise precisely when the hive fleet arrives to take advantage of the chaos they create. As the main fleet approaches, another weapon deploys. The shadow in the warp. The shadow in the warp is one of those things that is almost impossible to convey adequately in words, but it is the mechanism by which the Tyranids isolate their prey before the physical attack even begins. The hive mind is an enormously powerful psychic presence. The collective consciousness of trillions of organisms, all broadcasting into the warp simultaneously, creates a psychic noise of such overwhelming magnitude that it drowns out everything else. Astropaths, those psychically gifted individuals whose entire function in the Imperium is to transmit and receive messages through the warp, find themselves suddenly blind and deaf, their abilities swamped by the static of the approaching hive mind. Navigators, those mutant humans who use their psychic sight to guide ships through the warp, lose their ability to see the Astronomicon, that great psychic lighthouse that serves as the Imperium's navigational foundation. Ships that try to enter the warp in the vicinity of a hive fleet find themselves tumbling back into real space, as unable to navigate. Entire star systems go silent, cut off from the wider Imperium, unable to call for help or receive it. And this happens before a single Tyranid bioform has set foot on a world. By the time a planet's defenders realize they are facing a Tyranid invasion, they are already isolated, already alone, already without the ability to call for reinforcements. The psychological effect of the shadow in the warp is devastating in its own right. Psychers, those individuals with any degree of psychic sensitivity, begin to experience symptoms that range from debilitating headaches to outright madness. The psychic pressure of the approaching hive mind bleeds into the minds of even non-psychic creatures in the vicinity, producing a primal dread, a formless animal terror that the defenders of the target world cannot explain or escape. Or imagine, if you can, being a trooper in the Astra Militarum deployed to a world in the path of a hive fleet. You are already experiencing that low-level wrongness, that bone-deep unease that you cannot articulate and your commissar cannot explain away. You have heard the stories. Maybe you have even fought a splinter fleet engagement before, the kind of smaller-scale Tyranid contact that veteran soldiers refer to as a taste of what the real thing is like. You know what is coming, and you know, in some part of you, that the Departamento Munitorum has not managed to fully regiment away, that the number of creatures approaching your position is genuinely incomprehensible, that the tactics which worked in training and in smaller engagements are going to meet a test of scale that they were not designed for, that the walls you are standing behind, no matter how thick and well-made they are made of materials that the things approaching them regard as an inconvenience rather than an obstacle. And you stand at your post anyway, because you are a soldier of the Imperium, and this is what soldiers of the Imperium do. You check your lasgun. You pray if prayer is the thing that steadies you. You hold the line. That is the story of the Imperium in the age of the Tyranid Wars. And it is a story worth honoring. This is the Tyranid threat in its totality, not just the physical horror of the swarm itself, enormous and terrifying as that is, but the systematic, methodical way in which a target is isolated and softened before the killing blow even falls. The Tyranids are not warriors in any sense that the Imperium had previously encountered. Well, they are a force of nature wearing the face of an invading army, and the distinction matters more than anyone who hasn't experienced it can possibly understand. Now here is the thing that makes all of this genuinely existential rather than merely catastrophic. Everything described above, the hive fleets, the bioforms, the shadow in the warp, the terrible adaptive intelligence of the hive mind, all of it is only part of the picture. The hive fleets that have entered the galaxy so far are not the main force. They are not even the advanced elements of the main force. They are scouts, the fringe of something so vast that the Imperium does not yet have adequate language to describe it. The hive mind that humanity has encountered represents a tiny fraction of the total Tyranid presence, still moving through the intergalactic dark, still feeding and growing and following the psychic beacon that drew them toward this galaxy in the first place. That beacon is the Astronomicon, the great psychic lighthouse that the Emperor of mankind projects from his golden throne on Terra, that allows the Imperium's ships to navigate the warp across 50,000 light-years of space. The same light that has made human civilization across the galaxy possible is the same light that announced to something ancient and hungry that there was an enormous wealth of life here, waiting to be consumed. And that light has been burning since long before 745-41. Its effects were felt even earlier, in the time of the Horus heresy itself, through a chain of events that the men and women who set them in motion could never have anticipated. Section 3. The Pharaohs Incident. How the Galaxy was Noticed. There is a world called Sotha, tucked into the eastern fringe of the galaxy. In the time of the Horus Heresy, roughly 10,000 years before the events of the 41st millennium that this story is primarily concerned with, Sotha was home to a remarkable piece of technology: the Pharaohs, an ancient device of extraterrestrial origin, built from Necron technology, that functioned as something like a navigational beacon. Not as powerful as the Astronomicon, but finely tunable, capable of illuminating specific locations through the psychic fabric of the warp with remarkable precision. During the chaos of the Horus Heresy, when warp storms and the disruption caused by chaos had made travel and communication across vast distances profoundly unreliable, the Pharaohs became critically important. The Ultramarines used it to maintain contact and coordination across their forces during some of the darkest chapters of that civil war. But Sotha came under attack. The Night Lords, one of the traitor legions, who had sided with Horus in his terrible rebellion against the Emperor, launched an assault on Sotha and the Pharaohs. In the desperate defense that followed, a decision was made that seemed reasonable in the moment, given the options available, given what was at stake. The Pharaohs was overloaded, deliberately pushed beyond its operational limits in a suicide move that sent the Night Lord's fleet scattering across the void in disarray, preventing them from seizing and weaponizing the technology. It worked, in the immediate tactical sense. The Night Lords were stopped, but the Pharaohs, in its death, did something nobody had anticipated. It sent a pulse of psychic energy outward into space that was of a magnitude so far beyond its normal operation that it didn't just reach the nearby systems, didn't just radiate across the eastern fringe. It reached out beyond the galaxy, into the dark between the stars, where the intergalactic void stretches cold and empty and vast between island universes. And in that dark, something was sleeping. The Tyranids were already in transit between galaxies when the pulse from the Pharaohs reached them. In a state of something like hibernation, their bioships drifting through the absolute cold of intergalactic space, conserving every resource during the immense journey between feeding grounds. Sensor organisms registered the pulse. Slowly, across a timescale difficult to imagine, the fleet began to wake. To evaluate, to change course. The Pharaohs had served as a proof of concept. It said, in terms the hive mind could understand, there is life here. There is abundant, complex, organized life here. There is a psychic signature here of a kind that suggests an enormous density of biological richness. And then, after the Pharaohs fell silent, the Astronomicon continued to sing. It was still there, that great psychic beacon, burning with the power of 10,000 sacrificed psychers, channeled through the will of the enthroned emperor. Much larger and brighter than the Pharaohs had ever been, much more compelling as a signal. The fleet adjusted its course. Over the course of centuries, moving at speeds that are genuinely difficult to reconcile with intuitive human understanding of scale and distance, the tendrils of what would become Hive Fleet Behemoth began their long approach toward the Milky Way galaxy. It took nearly 10,000 years from the overloading of the Pharaohs to the moment that Hive Fleet Behemoth's outriders reached the eastern fringe. 10,000 years during which the Imperium was born in blood and sacrifice, during which the Emperor's death that isn't quite death left him entombed in the Golden Throne, during which the Imperium built itself into a civilization spanning 1,000,000 worlds, during which every war and tragedy and triumph of the post-heresy age played out in complete ignorance of what was moving through the intergalactic dark. The Tyranids noticed the Milky Way during the Horus Heresy. They arrived during the 41st millennium. The connection between those two facts is deeply uncomfortable, in the way that only the truly unintended consequences of pivotal decisions can be. There is a question that historians and scholars of the 41st millennium have turned over many times, in the rare moments when they have the luxury of examining history rather than surviving it. The question goes something like this: if the Pharaohs had not been overloaded, if the Night Lords had been stopped by some other means, would the Tyranids have ever found the galaxy? Would they have drifted on in their intergalactic dark, past the Milky Way and towards some other destination, following some other signal or some older instinct? Or was the galaxy's psychic richness always going to draw them in eventually, regardless of any specific event? There is no certain answer. The hive mind does not grant interviews, but the question matters, and because it sits at the foundation of everything that followed. The first contact between humanity and the Tyranids did not begin in 745 Mem 41, when a Mechanicus outpost on an ocean world detected something approaching from outside the galaxy. It began roughly 10,000 years earlier, in the moment when a desperate defender pushed an alien machine past its limits, and a pulse of light went out into the dark. Everything else that followed was, in a sense, the consequence of that original act. The dead worlds, the vanishing signals, the ocean world of Tyran, the Swarm Lord, the Battle of Macragge, the centuries of war that followed and continue to unfold. All of it traces back to that one decision, made under pressure, by people who had no way of knowing what they were doing, who were just trying to survive, just trying to stop something terrible from happening in the immediate term, which is, when you sit with it, about as human a story as there is. Section 4. The Moons of Imgal. The first hidden touch. Before the dead worlds. Before the data codex from Tyran. Before Inquisitor Cryptman stood on a scoured planet and began to connect the dots. Before any of that, there was a quieter encounter, one that at the time seemed entirely unrelated to anything that would come later, that was only recognized for what it truly was after Macragge, after the biological analysts spent years examining the evidence left by the First Tyrannic War, and made a discovery that sent a chill through every xenobiologist who understood its implications. The Moons of Imgal. Imgal is a world located in the galactic northwest, and its moons had been known to Imperial merchant traffic for some time as a region where strange creatures had been observed. Approximately around 500 of the 41st Millennium, roughly 2.5 centuries before Hive fleet Behemoth descended on the eastern fringe, Imperial merchant vessels operating in the region began encountering something in the dark places of those moons that was unlike anything in the established catalogues of alien life. Creatures with tentacular facial arrays, 6-limbed, fast, extremely dangerous, possessed of an unsettling physical adaptability that allowed them to alter their own flesh in response to the threats they faced, changing color, shifting the density of their carapace, even modifying the structure of their limbs to better suit the immediate combat situation. These creatures attacked the crews of ships that landed on or near the moons. They moved with the dedicated lethal efficiency of predators that had been doing nothing except waiting for prey for a very long time. They stowed away on vessels that managed to leave, spreading to new locations by the simple expedient of hiding in cargo holds and maintenance spaces, and enduring the vacuum of space with a hardiness that should not have been biologically possible. From Imgal, they spread slowly along the shipping lanes, appearing unexpectedly on worlds and space stations and hulks across the region. Always a surprise, always a threat. The initial Imperial assessment was that these were a previously unknown but apparently indigenous species, native to the moons of Imgal and spreading outward by the mechanism of ships unwittingly carrying them. They were named Imgal Genestealers, after the location of first discovery, and classified as a Xenos threat, requiring monitoring, and, where infestation was confirmed, elimination. This was an accurate operational assessment of the immediate problem. It was, as it turned out, profoundly wrong about what these creatures actually were. Several attempted purges were carried out against the Imgal Genestealer populations over the years. None were fully successful. Part of this was the practical difficulty of hunting creatures with the adaptive capabilities the Imgal strain possessed, their ability to change their physical characteristics in response to incoming attacks, making them genuinely difficult to engage with conventional extermination approaches. Part of it was the nature of the moons themselves, as riddled with tunnels and cave systems that the creatures knew intimately,
I have to be honest with you for a second. Out of every faction in 40k, every war, every Asian horror the setting has ever thrown at me, the Tyranids are the ones that genuinely unsettle me the most, and I've sat with that feeling for a while trying to understand why. I think it's because everything else in 40k, no matter how dark, still has intent behind it. Chaos wants your soul, the Necrons want their empire back, even the most brutal orc warlord wants something you can point at. But the Tyranids, they don't want anything from you specifically. You're just calories. Your civilization, your history, every person you've ever loved, it all registers as biomass. There's no bargaining with that. No appealing to it. No moment where you figure out the right move and turn the situation around. You either stop it physically or you don't exist anymore. And that to me is genuinely scarier than any demon or traitor the setting has produced. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
And human soldiers did not. The campaigns went into the dark and emerged diminished, the creatures still present, waiting in the deeper tunnels for the next expedition. Then came Macragge. Then came the long work of post-battle analysis, the Magos biologists spending years in their laboratories on Mars and on Macragge itself, examining the biological remains of the Tyranid creatures that had fought there, examining the genetics, comparing structures, and finding, in the genetic signature of the standard genestealers that the Tyranid swarm had used as shock troops, something very familiar. A relationship, unmistakable once identified, between the Tyranid genestealer and the Imgal variant that had been lurking in the galactic northwest for centuries. And they were the same creature. Variant strains, certainly, diverged by whatever process of isolation and adaptation had shaped the Imgal strain across decades of operating without the direction of the hive mind. But fundamentally, the same biological entity, carrying the same genetic heritage, serving the same ultimate purpose in the ecology of the Tyranid species. The Imgal genestealers were not indigenous to the moons. They were the remnant of something that had arrived there long before the moons became a named location on any imperial chart, carried by some mechanism that would take years of further investigation to even partially understand. The current best assessment, based on careful analysis of genetic drift and the timeline of events, is that the Imgal genestealers may have been introduced to the moons in the 35th millennium, around M35, 600 years before the events of Macragge. The suspected mechanism is connected to Hive Fleet Tiamat, one of those older, partially understood Tyranid presences that occupied a system in the eastern fringe called the Tiamat system. Imperial vessels sent to destroy whatever was in the Tiamat system may have unknowingly carried genestealer organisms back with them, hidden in their hulls, and deposited them on Imgal in the process of ordinary navigation. The creatures settled, lost their connection to the hive mind they had come from, and adapted to their new environment over the centuries that followed. What does it mean that the Imgal genestealers were present 2.5 centuries before the official first contact on Tyran? It means something deeply uncomfortable. It means the Tyranid vanguard, the scouts and infiltrators who move ahead of the main fleets, had been operating in the Milky Way galaxy for longer than anyone suspected. It means that the arrival of Hive Fleet Behemoth was not the beginning of the Tyranid presence in the galaxy. It was just the first time that presence made itself known in a way that could not be ignored. How many other things have been lurking in the dark places of the galaxy, unrecognized, unclassified, waiting? The Ordo Xenos does not publish complete answers to that question. The answers they have tend to produce a kind of thoughtful silence in the people who receive them. After Macragge established the truth of the Imgal connection, the Salamander's Space Marine chapter was dispatched to the moons to finish what earlier expeditions had been unable to complete. The campaign lasted for nearly 2 full years of brutal underground fighting. The Salamanders went into the dark tunnels of Imgal's moons with flame and hammer and the patient determination of warriors who understood that the task had to be done thoroughly or it was not worth doing at all. They found things in those tunnels, massive blind worm-like mutations that had grown enormous in the dark, broodlords of extraordinary power, individuals so deeply adapted to their isolation that they had become something distinct from the Imgal Genestealer baseline. The casualties were significant and consistent, amounting with the methodical inevitability of a campaign fought against an enemy that knew the terrain perfectly. The salamanders prevailed. When the Margos biologists eventually declared the moons of Imgal cleansed, it was accepted as a genuine achievement, a successful purge of what had been an ancient and persistent threat. It didn't last. The darkness of space is too large, and the creatures too hardy, and the mechanisms of their spread too difficult to intercept entirely. Imgal Genestealers continued to appear in unexpected places, carried aboard derelict hulks and cargo vessels, emerging from cargo bays on worlds that had been declared secure, proving that the galaxy's infestation was deeper and more pervasive than any single purge campaign could address. The full extent of the Genestealer infiltration of the Milky Way is not known. The Ordo Xenos believes it is extensive. The Tyranid hive fleets believe it is useful. The people living on worlds that are home to undiscovered Genestealer cults do not know they need to have an opinion on the subject. The moons of Imgal were, in retrospect, humanity's actual first contact with the Tyranid threat. It just didn't know it. The thing that tried to eat the crew of a merchant ship in the dark of an alien moon, around 500 EMS 41, was a Tyranid organism, however isolated and mutated and disconnected from the hive mind it might have been. The first human to encounter a Tyranid and survive the experience was probably some merchant sailor or dock worker whose name was never recorded, who filed a report about strange creatures on a moon that seemed like a navigational hazard rather than the forward scout of a galactic extinction event. That person almost certainly did not understand what they had seen. How could they have? There was no framework for it yet. But somewhere in a file that nobody had yet understood how to read, the record of that encounter sat and waited for the world to catch up to its significance. The world would take until Macragge to catch up, and the cost of that delay was enormous. Section 5. The Shadow Before the Storm. Dead Worlds and Early Signs. The official first contact between the Imperium of Man and the Tyranids is dated to early 745 of the 41st Millennium, but the signs were there for a decade before that date, and scattered across the eastern fringe like whispers in a language that nobody had yet learned to read. The Adeptus Mechanicus, those devoted servants of the Omnissiah who combine religious devotion with a scientist's hunger for knowledge and data, had been conducting extensive explorator surveys of the eastern fringe in the years preceding Behemoth's arrival. The eastern fringe was, and still is, something of a frontier in Imperial terms. It sits at the very edge of the Astronomican's reach, that region where the great psychic beacon barely penetrates and navigation becomes more art than science. Worlds out there were often poorly documented, isolated, and potentially rich with the kinds of archaeological and biological data that the Mechanicus found valuable. While the survey ships move from system to system with the patient, methodical approach of explorers, who have all the time implied by a civilization measured in millennia, and they began to find something disturbing. Worlds that should have been teeming with life were not. Not just quiet, not just damaged or war-scarred in the familiar ways that Imperial space often showed the marks of ancient conflict. Gone. These worlds had been stripped of life in a way that went beyond anything the surveyors had prior experience with. No corpses, no ruins, not even the simple bacterial ecosystems that persist in the soil and water of worlds that have been devastated by conventional warfare or natural catastrophe. Every molecule of biological matter had been removed. Every trace of organic chemistry had been erased, as if the worlds had been scoured down to bare rock and then scoured again, until not even the memory of life remained. The exploratory census filed reports to the Explorator General. Planets known to have hosted life, some visited within living memory by other survey vessels, had been reduced to lifeless, barren rock. The reports described worlds of eerie silence, worlds where the wind moved over empty stone under alien skies, worlds where nothing moved and nothing grew and nothing sang, worlds that had become somehow, more dead than ordinary dead things usually manage to be. These reports were filed. They were catalogued. They were passed through various imperial administrative layers, each of which noted them with the kind of professional detachment that comes from processing large volumes of information that is unusual but not immediately actionable. The Imperium's bureaucracy, vast and slow-moving as geological time, absorbed these anomalies without generating any particular urgency. There was an inquisitor named Fidus Cryptman who was different. Cryptman was an Ordo Xenos man, which already put him in a particular category. The Ordo Xenos is the division of the Inquisition specifically tasked with understanding and countering alien threats to the Imperium. Its members tend to develop over the course of careers spent in close proximity to things that should not exist, a very particular kind of attentiveness, a radar for wrongness. It's an instinct for the moment when something that looks like a routine anomaly is actually the edge of something much larger. Cryptman had been tracking the reports of dead worlds on the Eastern Fringe for some time. He had visited several of them personally. Standing on those stripped, silent worlds, breathing air that was technically still within normal parameters but felt somehow wrong, he had come to a conclusion that most of his colleagues found alarmist. These worlds had not died naturally. They had not been the victims of some new and particularly thorough plague, or of a weapon system capable of biological mass destruction. The pattern of the deaths, the completeness of them, the way they seemed to be progressing from one region toward another, in a way that suggested a trajectory. All of it pointed to something he couldn't yet name, but could feel in the methodical way that good investigators feel things before they can prove them. Something was eating worlds. Something was moving through the Eastern Fringe, consuming everything organic on every world it passed, and then moving on. And it was, based on the pattern of the dead worlds, moving toward the interior of the galaxy. He filed his preliminary assessments. He requested resources. He was told, in the politely frustrating language of institutional bureaucracy, that the matter was being taken under advisement, that the dead worlds required further study before conclusions could be drawn, that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. Cryptman kept looking. He visited more of the dead worlds. He built up a map of the pattern, as a visual representation of where the deaths were clustered and in what temporal sequence they seemed to have occurred. The map told a clear story to anyone willing to look at it. Something was moving on a trajectory that, extrapolated forward, aimed at the most densely inhabited region of the Eastern Fringe, and beyond that, at the interior of the galaxy. He shared the map with his superiors. He was told, again, that further verification was needed, and the dead worlds kept accumulating, and something out in the dark kept moving, vast and patient, and utterly indifferent to the fact that there were people trying to understand what it was doing. Meanwhile, on the worlds of the Eastern Fringe that were still alive, strange things were beginning to happen that would retrospectively be understood as the work of genestealer cult infiltration. In the grim darkness of industrial undercities and agricultural backwater towns, in the deep mining tunnels and the maintenance corridors of space stations, there were people who were not quite as entirely human as they appeared. People who had been touched, perhaps generations ago, by something that had passed through or hidden in the dark places. People who harbored a devotion to entities they thought of as gods, who whispered prayers in tongues that didn't quite fit the shapes of human mouths. These were the harbingers, the ones who had been seeded long before anyone knew what seeding meant in a Tyranid context. The genestealer cult members who would, when the moment came, rise up to assist the arrival of something that would consume them along with everyone else. They didn't know that part. But the cult's members genuinely believed in the transcendence that was coming, in the meeting with their god forms that would elevate them beyond ordinary existence. They could not have known that their psychic devotion was functioning as a beacon, a signal, a dinner bell rung across the light years toward a fleet that was already following the much larger beacon of the Astronomicon toward the galaxy's interior. The dead worlds were the footprints. The genestealer cults were the welcome mats, and the ocean world of Tyran was the place where the door finally opened. Section 6. First Contact at Tyran. The Fall of Tyran Primus. Tyran Primus was not, by any conventional measure, a remarkable world. An ocean world, and its surface mostly covered by vast seas, alive with creatures that the Adeptus Mechanicus had found valuable for the purposes of scientific study. The planetary geography was unusual, its small landmasses being the remnant crests of ancient volcanic island chains thrust up through the endless water, shaped over geological time by the same deep processes that built mountains and carved valleys. There was a Mechanicus outpost there, built into the ruins of those ancient islands, a hardened research installation that served partly as a base for ongoing xenobiological and oceanographic research, and partly as a waypoint and forward listening post for the surveys of the surrounding eastern fringe systems. The outpost was not a defensive installation in the military sense, but it had been built for the environment of the eastern fringe, which meant it had been built tough. 4 large planetary defense lasers stood guard over the installation, each housed in ceramite silos with void shield generators protecting them. The seas around Tyran Primus were home to things large and dangerous enough that the outpost's designers had made reasonable provision for their potential hostility. The Tyran outpost had walls that could take a beating and weapons that could deliver one, and the people who worked there had a justified pride in their ability to maintain operations in conditions that would defeat a lesser installation. There was also an astropath on Tyran, that particular individual, that psychically gifted person whose function was to transmit and receive messages through the warp for the outpost's communication needs, was about to have a very bad time. Yet the first sign that something was wrong came from an unexpected direction. A survey starship, returning from a cataloging run of yet another distant system, had been passing through the edge of the Tyran system when it encountered something it couldn't identify. A cloud of objects, dense enough to register on its detection systems, spread widely enough to suggest a deliberate formation rather than a natural phenomenon, and organic, unmistakably, wrongly, disturbingly organic. Some of the objects behaved like mines, detonating against the ship's hull with enough force to leave it crippled. It staggered back toward the Tyran outpost on wounded drives, carrying the crew's first-hand account of something in space that had no business being there. The outpost command received this report. Magos Varnak, the senior Adeptus Mechanicus administrator overseeing the installation, was a person who took his responsibilities seriously in the way that the best of the Mechanicus do, with a meticulous care for detail and a genuine reverence for the preservation of knowledge. He began to prepare. The cloud of objects, whatever they were, had been detected at the edge of the system. There was time, perhaps days, to understand what was coming and mount some kind of response. What Varnak did not know, and what nobody on Tyran Primus could have known, was that the astropath had already lost contact with the broader Imperium. The shadow in the warp had fallen over Tyran without anyone noticing it happen. That smothering psychic blanket that arrives ahead of the hive fleet like a wave of numbness before a terrible pain. The astropath could feel the wrongness, the way that every attempt to reach out through the warp met with nothing but noise, enormous noise. The psychic equivalent of trying to shout in the middle of a thunderstorm. But there was no reference point, no prior experience, no framework for understanding what was happening. Every attempt to reach out was answered by a cacophony that produced nothing useful except the mounting certainty that something very, very large was approaching. Several days after the crippled survey ship's report, the leading elements of Hive Fleet Behemoth reached Tyran Primus. What arrived was not something that any defender on Tyran had the vocabulary to describe adequately. The bioships of Hive Fleet Behemoth are things that defy easy categorization. They range in size from creatures not much larger than a conventional Imperial warship to entities of nightmarish proportion, biovessels so vast that they blot out the stars in their shadow. They are living things, these ships, not the mechanical constructions that humanity uses to cross the void. They move with a kind of horrible organic purpose that mechanical ships don't possess, a quality of intentionality that makes them unsettling even before they begin to do what they were built to do. Their hulls are chitinous and armored, layered with the biological equivalent of ceramite plates. They breathe void gases through enormous organs. They are alive in ways that make them disturbing to encounter, and, as Varnak and the defenders of Tyran were about to discover, extraordinarily difficult to kill. The orbital engagement was savage and one-sided. The outpost's defense lasers, those weapons that had been built to handle the threats a frontier world might plausibly face, fired into the approaching biofleet with every ounce of energy their void shield generators could provide. Against individual large creatures, against a conventional enemy fleet, they would have been effective. Against the sheer volume of what was descending on Tyran Primus, they were like trying to stop the tide with a wall of buckets. Some of the approaching bioforms were destroyed. The defense lasers burned through chitin and organic armor and left blackened craters in the flesh of things that had no right to be anywhere near an inhabited world. But for every one that was stopped, 20 more continued their descent. Spores began to rain down on the installation as a biological artillery barrage of living organisms delivering the swarm's initial assault. The seas of Tyran Primus, those vast oceans that had been the whole reason the installation existed, churned as the first Tyranid organisms hit the water and began to move toward land. The ground assault was a nightmare. Hormagaunts moved through the outpost's outer defenses in waves so dense that the sheer weight of biological mass was sufficient to overcome physical barriers that would have held against conventional attacks. They were fast, these creatures. Faster than anything that size had any right to be. Their bladed limbs moved with a mechanical efficiency that seemed wrong coming from living creatures, each motion perfected by whatever the hive mind had decided was optimal for the destruction of this specific kind of target. Skitarii, in those augmented cybernetic soldiers who served as the Adeptus Mechanicus military component, fought back with flamer weapons and rapid-fire guns. Imperial guardsmen who happened to be present threw themselves into the defense with the desperate courage of people who understood they were going to lose but fought anyway, because that is what people do in those moments. The outpost fell layer by layer. Each defensive line that had been prepared held for a time and then was overrun. The enormous mass of the swarm was not something that could be meaningfully reduced by the defenders' firepower, not at the volume in which it descended on Tyran. The Tyranids did not seem to care about losses. They did not adjust their tactics to avoid the heaviest fire. They simply pressed forward, absorbing casualties that would have shattered any conventional military force. Because a conventional military force is composed of individuals who have some sense of self-preservation, some calculation about whether the attack is worth the cost. The swarm had no such calculation to make. Its math was different. A dead Tyranid bioform was biomass that would eventually be reclaimed. A living defender was an obstacle to be removed. Varnak watched the fall of his outpost through the remaining functional displays in the command bunker, that hardened last redoubt that had been designed to survive the worst that the eastern fringe could throw at it. The walls of the bunker were beginning to take impacts that registered on every stress sensor in the facility. Outside, something very large was beating on the adamantium gate. He was, in the ancient tradition of his kind, thinking about data. Not about survival. Not about rescue. About the information that was being captured in the outpost's recording systems, the visual feeds, and sensor data, and biological analysis readouts that were documenting, in unprecedented detail, the nature of the creatures that were destroying his world. This information was unprecedented. Whatever was attacking Tyran Primus was unlike anything in the Mechanicus xenobiological database, unlike anything in any Imperial archive that Varnak had access to. And whoever came after, whoever survived to receive and analyze this data, would need it desperately. He prepared a data codex, an emergency information package containing every piece of data the outpost's systems had gathered about the attack. Video recordings of the bioforms, picked captures of the bioships in orbit, sensor readings of the organic composition of the creatures, Tactical observations about how they moved and attacked and absorbed fire and kept coming. He loaded all of it into a physical data storage device, one of the most important pieces of technology that would ever exist in the 41st millennium, and he directed it to be dropped into a bore shaft in the depths of the facility, nearly 3,000 meters below the surface, below the waterline, below the rock, where the ocean and the stone would hide it from whatever was coming. The adamantium gate crashed inward. The hormagaunts poured through. Magos Varnak whispered his last prayer to the Omnissiah, the machine god of his people, and with the specific quality of someone who knows that prayer is probably not going to change the immediate outcome, but offers it anyway, because the offering has meaning in itself. And then the swarm was on him, and Tyran Primus had one less person in it. The planet was consumed, completely, utterly, in the thorough and terrible way that only the Tyranids accomplish. The oceans were drunk, the atmosphere was processed. The biology of the world, every creature that swam in the seas, and every microbial colony in the rock, and every piece of organic chemistry in the soil, was broken down and incorporated into the hive fleet's biomass reserves. Where there had been an ocean world full of life, there was, within a relatively brief time, a rock. A sterile, silent, perfectly dead rock, or orbiting its sun in a system that no longer contained any biological activity whatsoever. Tyran Primus was classified afterward as a dead world, the first of many in Imperial space to carry that designation for that particular reason. Section 7. Inquisitor Cryptman and the Warning. Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman arrived at Tyran Primus sometime after the fleet had moved on. Moving on is, of course, what a Tyranid hive fleet does. It consumes a world and then continues toward the next one, driven by the constant need to replenish the biomass that the swarm requires to sustain itself and continue growing. By the time Cryptman's ship dropped out of the warp near the Tyran system, the bioships were already gone. The shadow in the warp had lifted, partially, enough that a skilled enough navigator could find the system again. Was it enough that Cryptman could land? What he found when he walked the surface of Tyran Primus is something that very few people in the galaxy had ever experienced and lived to reflect on. An absolutely, completely dead world. Not war-damaged, not plague-struck, not the kind of dead that still has soil bacteria and lichens and fungal colonies in the rock. Dead in the way that the early planets were dead before life first emerged on them. Dead the way a planet would be if you took everything biological off of it, down to the last complex molecule, and left behind only mineral rock and the thin skeleton of an atmosphere. Cryptman was a man of considerable experience with alien threats, as his decades of inquisitorial service attested. He had seen things that would destroy the equanimity of most human beings. He was not prone to melodrama, or to the kind of reflexive fear response that the Inquisition tended to train out of its members in any case. But standing on the scoured surface of Tyran Primus, looking at the absolute completeness of what had happened there, something in him registered the magnitude of the threat, with a clarity that must have felt like cold water. His team found the bore shaft, found the data codex, 3,000 meters down in the rock, found Varnak's gift to the future, the package of information that the Magos had assembled in his final hours and committed to the stone in the hope that someone would come for it. Cryptman retrieved the codex and he read it. He watched the recorded images of the bioforms that had attacked the outpost, the swarm coming over the walls like a living tide. Was the shapes of creatures utterly alien to anything in Imperial experience? He reviewed the sensor data. He looked at the analysis of the organic composition of the attacking creatures, that initial bewildered Mechanicus assessment of biology that shouldn't work the way it apparently did. And he connected it to the dead worlds. Not just Tyran Primus, but the series of them stretching across the eastern fringe like a trail of absence, a path of nothing that pointed from outside the galaxy toward its interior. He looked at the trajectory implied by those dead worlds, looked at what world came next, and then the one after that, and followed the line to its logical endpoint. The trajectory pointed toward Ultramar. Ultramar. The pocket empire governed by the Ultramarines, chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, bet that remarkable subdomain within the larger Imperium where the Ultramarines had maintained their homeworld of Macragge and a handful of surrounding systems as something genuinely worth protecting and preserving. Ultramar was, by almost any measure, one of the finest pieces of the Imperium. Well-governed, well-defended, densely populated, agriculturally rich, and home to one of the most respected Space Marine chapters in existence. It was not a backwater. It was not somewhere that could be sacrificed without extraordinary cost. And it was directly in the path of whatever was coming. Cryptman named the threat. In the tradition of the Ordo Xenos, which assigns formal designations to alien entities it identifies, he classified this new species based on the world of their first recorded contact with the Imperium. He called them the Tyranids. The name would carry the weight of everything that followed from that moment, become one of the most significant words in the lexicon of human civilization, synonymous with the kind of existential threat that the galaxy had previously been spared even while enduring almost everything else imaginable. The next challenge was communication. The shadow in the warp still fell heavily over the region, disrupting astropathic communication in ways that made getting a warning out profoundly difficult. Cryptman's astropath fought against the psychic static, pouring everything available into the attempt to push a message through. The effort was, by all accounts, physically devastating. The act of transmitting through the shadow's interference is agonizing for psychically sensitive individuals. It's a direct contest with the overwhelming presence of the hive mind's collective consciousness. Blood and worse poured from the astropath's nose and ears as the message was forced into the warp against all the pressure that the approaching fleet could bring to bear. But the message got through. A single voice spoke back from the darkness, and it came from Macragge. Cryptman received his orders from the Ordo Xenos. Travel to Macragge. Assist in mounting a defense. Bring everything you've learned with you. He went as fast as his ship could carry him, as fast as the damaged warp routes would allow, and by some grace of fortune or timing that would later be classified as the closest imaginable near disaster, he arrived at Ultramar ahead of the fleet, ahead of Behemoth, by a margin that was, in retrospect, extraordinarily thin. But the meeting between Inquisitor Cryptman and Chapter Master Marneus Calgar under the white marble portico of the Ultramarines' palace on Macragge is one of those encounters in Imperial history that gets told and retold because it carries the weight of what followed. Calgar was, even by the standards of Space Marine chapter masters, a formidable presence. His stature was grand even among the superhuman. His authority, the kind that comes from decades of command and from carrying the genetic inheritance of a Primarch, was palpable. He stood and listened to Cryptman's account, which must have been, by any measure, one of the more extraordinary briefings any military commander had ever received. He listened to the description of the dead worlds. He reviewed the data codex from Tyran. He heard Cryptman's assessment of the trajectory of the fleet and its estimated composition. He looked at the visual records of the bioforms that had destroyed the outpost, at the bioships that had consumed the planet, at the absolute devastation that had been visited on Tyran Primus. And then, Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, began to plan. Calgar had a characteristic that served him well in this moment, and in every difficult command decision of his long career. He did not allow the magnitude of a threat to paralyze him. He gathered information, he assessed it as accurately as the information permitted, and then he committed to action. The threat posed by the approaching fleet was, based on everything Cryptman had shown him, unlike anything the Ultramarines had faced in their long history. The Codex Astartes, the great tactical manual that Calgar's Primarch Roboute Guilliman had written to govern Space Marine doctrine, did not contain a chapter on Tyranid hive fleets, because it had been written 10,000 years before the Tyranids arrived. Calgar was going to be, in a very real sense, writing those chapters himself, in the blood of his soldiers and the burning wreckage of his battles. He had one advantage. He had time. Not much, but some. And he used it. Section 8. The First Tyrannic War. Hive Fleet Behemoth, and the Battle of Macragge. The defense of Macragge was a masterpiece of preparation in the face of extraordinary odds. Calgar recognized, with the clarity that distinguished him as a military commander, that the coming battle would be fought on two fronts simultaneously. In space, the Tyranid bioships would need to be engaged before they could release their full complement of ground forces onto Macragge's surface. And on the ground, whatever survived the orbital engagement would need to be met by defenders capable of holding against the kind of swarm that had swept over Tyran Primus. Neither front could be neglected. Losing in space while winning on the ground was a path to eventual destruction. Winning in space while losing on the ground was the same. The battle had to be fought everywhere, simultaneously, with every resource available. The Ultramarines mobilized their entire chapter. Every company, every squad, every Space Marine who could be recalled to Macragge was recalled. The realm of Ultramar's defense forces were put on full operational footing. Civilian ships were requisitioned and armed. The orbital defenses, already formidable by any standard, were further reinforced. Star Nova-class orbital weapon stations were deployed around the planet. Every warship that could be gathered from across Ultramar was brought to Macragge and positioned in the defensive fleet. Cryptman sent out the call for help beyond Ultramar. Battlefleet Tempestus, the navy formation responsible for the Segmentum Tempestus, and a substantial force in their own right, was dispatched toward Macragge. Their arrival would not be guaranteed or timely, but the request was made. And then, the fleet arrived. The scale of Hive Fleet Behemoth's advance on Macragge was something that nobody who witnessed it ever quite found adequate words for. The bioships came in waves, a sequence of assaults that built in intensity rather than relenting, but each one larger and more ferocious than the last. They came at the Imperial fleet like living ordnance, throwing their bodies into gun range with a disregard for their own losses that had no precedent in any naval engagement the Ultramarines' centuries of experience had prepared them for. The battle strategies of the Codex Astartes proved inadequate, not because they were poorly conceived, but because they had been designed for enemies who behaved in recognizably rational ways. Enemies who cared, at some level, about losing ships. The Tyranids did not care. Each wave of bioships that was destroyed simply taught the hive mind something about how the defenders were operating. The tactical information was absorbed, and the next wave adjusted accordingly. The Ultramarines and their fleet were not fighting a fleet. They were fighting a learning organism of galactic scale, one that treated the destruction of its own components as acceptable tuition fees paid in the acquisition of tactical knowledge. The battle barge Caesar went down in the first assault wave. The destruction of the Caesar created a breach in the defensive perimeter, and the third assault wave exploited it, slipping through to engage Ultramar's merchant fleet with deadly effect. By the ninth wave, the Star Nova orbital stations, those carefully positioned defensive installations that had been designed to form the backbone of Macragge's orbital defense, had been reduced to debris. By the 12th assault wave, the orbital defenses were effectively shattered. Macragge lay open to the swarm, as the bioships descended into position above the planet's atmosphere and began to do what bioships do when the orbital defenses are gone. They released mycetic spores, millions of them, a rain of organic drop pods filled with the foot soldiers of the swarm, descending toward Macragge's surface with the inevitability of a falling sky. The spores struck the polar fortresses, those heavily defended installations at Macragge's northern and southern extremes that served as the planet's primary ground defense anchors. And the ground war began. Calgar had not been idle while the space battle raged. He had analyzed what he knew about the swarm's tactics, the way it operated on Tyran as documented in Varnak's data codex, and developed the best response his considerable intelligence could devise. He distributed his forces between the polar fortresses with particular attention to the northern one, which his tactical assessment identified as the more critical. He positioned his troops to maximize the utility of Macragge's own geography, using the frozen terrain and the massive defensive walls to compensate for the numerical disadvantage his forces were facing. At Cold Steel Ridge, an industrial complex on the frozen northern seas, where a company of defense auxilia held their position, reinforced by a Baneblade tank called the Pride of Hera, the battle took on a particular intensity. The swarm that hit Cold Steel Ridge was overwhelming in volume, but that wasn't the most dangerous thing about it. The most dangerous thing was what arrived partway through the engagement: the Swarmlord. Yet the Swarmlord is a unique creature within the Tyranid hierarchy, something that represents the hive mind's answer to the problem of particularly dangerous opponents. It is not simply a very powerful hive tyrant, though it is certainly that. It is the hive mind's personal instrument, the direct expression of the Gestalt's tactical intelligence in a single, extraordinarily capable biological form. When the Swarmlord appears on a battlefield, the character of the swarm changes. The near-mindless massed advance that characterizes most Tyranid tactics is replaced by something that has recognizable strategic intent, that deploys its forces with cunning, that anticipates the defender's responses and works around them. The Swarmlord arrived at Cold Steel Ridge and immediately changed the battle. Where the defenders had been coping with the swarm's raw numbers, they now faced a force that was thinking. The Baneblade Pride of Hera, that massive armored vehicle that had been one of the most effective individual weapons in the northern defense, was identified as the critical threat and subjected to a coordinated attack that stripped away its supporting infantry with a diversion before bringing Carnifexes to bear directly on the tank itself. The assault was effective. The Pride of Hera was destroyed. Calgar himself came to the surface of Macragge, leading elements of the Third Company into the desperate fighting to relieve the defenders at the northern polar fortress. He engaged the Swarmlord personally, a confrontation that was extraordinary in its intensity and outcome. Calgar survived. The Swarmlord officially did not. But Calgar was grievously wounded in the encounter, wounded enough to be extracted from the battle for medical attention that kept him alive at the cost of removing him from command at the most critical moment. In space, Calgar had not surrendered the initiative entirely. He had identified that the Tyranid fleet was presenting an opportunity as well as a threat. The bioships, having deposited their spores on Macragge, moved to encircle the planet. Calgar, from his temporary position at Octavius, where his damaged fleet was reorganizing, led a series of raids against the encircling bioships, coordinating harassing attacks that disrupted the Tyranid effort to consolidate their hold on the system. And he laid a trap. The Tyranid fleet took the bait, as moving to pursue Calgar's fleet toward the ringed world of Circe at the edge of the Macragge system. The bioships outnumbered the Imperial fleet significantly, and they knew it, which was perhaps the first mistake the hive mind made in the entire engagement. They moved into Circe's rings confident that the trap they had laid there, a second fleet concealed among the ice and rock of the planet's ring system, would be sufficient to destroy the Ultramarines. And it would have been. That second fleet sprang their ambush, and the Imperials were caught between two Tyranid forces in a vice that should have ended everything. Then, Battlefleet Tempestus arrived. More than 200 warships dropped into real space and caught the Tyranid fleet from the opposite direction, creating a three-way engagement that the Tyranid numerical advantage was no longer sufficient to dominate. The battle was ferocious and costly on all sides, but the arrival of Tempestus had changed the math, and even with their numbers, the bioships could not manage simultaneously fighting a battle fleet in front of them and another at their backs. Even so, the Tyranids still had numerical superiority. The battle might have gone either way. Then Admiral of Battlefleet Tempestus made the decision that ended Hive Fleet Behemoth's threat to Macragge. The Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra, a vessel of enormous size and power, drove straight into the heart of the Hive Fleet at full speed. Its warp drives were detonated deliberately. The resulting warp vortex was catastrophic in its local effect, and pulling the Dominus Astra and the majority of Hive Fleet Behemoth's remaining bioships into the unmeasurable chaos of the Imperium, destroying both in an act of sacrifice that would be remembered as one of the defining moments of the First Tyrannic War. With the space battle decided, Calga returned to Macraga's surface. The swarm was still there, still fighting, still lethal. The northern polar fortress had been the site of some of the most intense fighting the Ultramarines had ever faced. The First Company, those elite veterans in Terminator armor who represented the pinnacle of the chapter's experience and capability, had held the northern polar defenses against everything the swarm threw at them. They held their position through the long, terrible hours of the ground battle, while they held it past the point where any military calculus would have called them justified in withdrawing. They held it because they were the First Company of the Ultramarines, because those ancient walls were worth their lives, because the alternative was the swarm breaking through into the planet's interior. The First Company was found exactly where they had been positioned, every single one of them, lying where they had fallen, their ammunition spent, their armor marked by countless impacts and rents, and the physical evidence of a battle fought until there was nothing left to fight with. The entire First Company of the Ultramarines had been destroyed to the last warrior, defenders of a line that was worth holding even to that absolute cost. Behemoth was defeated. Macragge survived. The Ultramarines had paid a price that would take them generations to recover from, their chapter at perhaps its weakest point since its founding. The First Company's operational strength would remain below 50% until 841 of the 41st Millennium, nearly 100 years after the battle. The chapter would not officially record that it had replaced all its losses from Macragge until 861, 116 years after the battle. Marneus Calga himself survived his wounds, but bore their mark for the rest of his very long life. Chaplain Ortan Cassius, Master of Sanctity of the Ultramarines, asked for and received permission to create a new kind of warrior in the wake of Macragge. The Tyrannic War Veterans. A cadre of Space Marines specifically trained and equipped to fight the Tyranids, in incorporating the hard-won tactical knowledge bought at such terrible cost during the First Tyrannic War. The existence of these specialized warriors was, in its own way, an acknowledgement that the threat was not over, that there would be more, that what had just been survived was not the end of something, but the beginning. Section 9. The Long Silence and Second Contact. Hive Fleet Kraken. After Macragge, the Imperium maintained a military presence along the eastern fringe, a watchful posture, standing guard against the possibility that more would come. This made sense. Kripman had argued, and the evidence supported him, that the Tyranids were not a singular event, but an ongoing threat from outside the galaxy, and that Behemoth was likely just the first fleet to arrive rather than the only one. For over 200 years, while he was apparently wrong. The years passed, the decades accumulated, the century mark came and went, and then the second century, and the military presence on the eastern fringe became harder to justify to the administrators and bureaucrats who were responsible for allocating Imperial Guard regiments and Imperial Navy ships across a galaxy that never seemed to stop generating crises elsewhere. The argument was made, repeatedly and with increasing persuasiveness, that perhaps Behemoth had been the sum total of the Tyranid threat, that the galaxy had been lucky, had beaten the worst of it, and that the resources committed to watching a threat that wasn't manifesting could be better used elsewhere. The Inquisition pushed back. Kripman pushed back. The data suggested that Behemoth was too large to have come from nothing, in that something capable of generating a fleet of that size must have more of them somewhere. But the bureaucratic argument is a powerful one when the counter-evidence is the absence of a thing rather than its presence. The absence of more Tyranids looked, after enough years, an awful lot like proof that the Tyranid threat had been defeated. What it actually looked like was the quiet before a second storm. Around 992 of the 41st Millennium, strange things began happening along the eastern fringe. Worlds erupted in rebellion and civil unrest. Terrorism and sabotage incidents increased dramatically across a broad region. There was violence in the deep levels of hive cities. riots in agricultural settlements, unexplained disappearances, and a general atmosphere of rising tension that seemed inexplicable in conventional terms. It's the same administratum voices that had argued for reducing the Eastern Fringe's military presence now claimed that these disturbances were the natural consequence of an unnecessarily militarized region, making the population anxious and resentful. The Inquisition investigated and found, to nobody's surprise who was paying attention, that the dissenting adepts promoting this interpretation of events had a pattern in common. They had all either come from the southeastern region of the galaxy or had traveled there recently. Some of them were, when subjected to proper biological examination, not entirely human. The Genestealer cult had been working, quietly and patiently, for decades, perhaps longer. The unrest on the fringe worlds was not the population's dissatisfaction with Imperial military presence. It was the swarm's vanguard, the biological advance work of a second hive fleet that had already been in transit and was now, finally, drawing close enough that its psychic influence was beginning to affect the minds of the cult members it had seeded years before. Hive Fleet Kraken arrived. If Hive Fleet Behemoth had been characterized by a brutal, direct frontal assault, the kind of attack that comes from a fleet comfortable in its own overwhelming power, Hive Fleet Kraken represented something that the Imperium found in some ways even more disturbing. Kraken did not attack on a narrow front. It attacked everywhere. Multiple tendrils, each one enormous, reaching into different parts of the galaxy simultaneously, stretching Imperial defenses to their breaking point by demanding responses in too many places at once. The Imperium could mass its forces at Macragge to fight Behemoth. It could not mass its forces in 30 different places simultaneously to fight Kraken. Among the first worlds consumed by Kraken were Sotha, the world of the pharaohs, whose overloading had attracted the Tyranids in the first place, and several others, whose names became synonyms for loss among the people who remembered them. The Scythes of the Emperor Space Marine. Chapter, whose homeworld was Sotha, lost everything in the opening phase of Kraken's advance. Their chapter was shattered, reduced to a fraction of its strength, and would spend years trying to rebuild from a foundation that had been quite literally consumed. And one of the tendrils of Hive Fleet Kraken turned in a direction that the Imperium had not anticipated, and perhaps could not have adequately defended against, even if it had. It turned toward craftworld Iyanden. Iyanden was one of the great craft worlds of the Eldari, those ancient people who had once ruled a galactic empire and now survived in these vast world ships drifting through the void. Craft world Iyanden was one of the largest of these, home to a significant population of Eldari who had preserved their culture and their lives through the catastrophe that had reduced their species from galaxy-spanning civilization to wandering remnant. Iyanden was not a small or easily dismissed target. The Rangers of Iyanden, those far-wandering scouts who monitored the space around the craft world, brought the first warning. A fleet of immense proportions was approaching. Already, over a dozen Imperial planets had been consumed in its advance, and although the Imperium was fighting back where it could, it would be months before any significant Imperial force could be redirected to assist Iyanden. The Eldari were, in this moment, on their own. Farseer Kelman, the spiritual leader of Iyanden, made the decision that the entire population would fight. Every citizen was to be armed and deployed. The craft world's war machines were activated, and in the most significant and painful decision of all, Kelmon ordered the awakening of the ghost warriors, the Wraith Guard, those constructs of wraithbone that housed the souls of Iyanden's dead, the ancient warriors who had fallen in battles long past and been preserved in these honored artificial forms. As awakening them was not done lightly. Each awakening disturbed the soul within, pulled it back from whatever peaceful existence waited beyond death, forced it to return to something like life and fight again. It was considered a profound imposition, a sacred violation, undertaken only in extremis. The first Tyranid swarms attacked Iyanden 20 days after the Rangers had brought word. By that point, the craft world had been isolated for over a week by the shadow in the warp, cut off from communication with any other Eldari people, unreachable by any cry for help. The Eldari fleet initially held well, their vessels faster and more maneuverable than the Tyranid bioships, their weapons carrying greater range. For a time, the defenders could engage on their own terms, and the early losses among the bioships were significant. But Tyranid tactics adapt, and the sheer scale of the fleet was extraordinary. The Craftworld's capacity to replace destroyed warships could not keep pace with the casualties being suffered. Wave after wave of bioships crashed against the Iandan fleet, each wave incorporating lessons from the previous one, and slowly, over days of continuous fighting, the balance shifted. The Elder fleet was being ground down. The bioships began landing on the Craftworld itself. This was the thing that Iandan's defenders had feared above all else, the nightmare that haunted every Craftworld security planning. The Tyranids, inside the ship, inside the living structure of the vessel, that was the last home of a dying people. The battles inside Iandan's corridors and domes and halls were desperate beyond adequate description. Aspect, warriors, those Eldari who had devoted themselves to specific warrior paths, fought alongside guardians, ordinary citizens who had taken up arms because there was nothing else to do. The avatar of Cain, that burning war god, given form by the concentrated martial devotion of the Eldari, strode through the battle like a pillar of fire. The ghost warriors walked among the living, and the dead of Iandan fought alongside its living to defend the home that held all of them together. It was not enough. The Tyranids were too many, too adaptive, too relentless. Iandan was being devoured. And then, into the midst of this catastrophe, Prince Iriel arrived. Iriel was a complicated figure in Iandan's history. He had been the Craftworld's High Admiral, and he had been stripped of that title decades before these events, following a military campaign that had been brilliant in execution and unauthorized in scope, a campaign that had made an enemy out of a Chaos fleet that had previously been distracted elsewhere. He had been judged to have endangered Iandan by making unnecessary enemies, and so he had been exiled, had formed his own Corsair fleet of exceptional skill and daring, and had been living in the wild spaces between established territories ever since. He had sworn never to return to Iandan. When word reached him of what was happening, he broke that oath. Iriel brought his Corsairs, the Eldritch Raiders, those hardened Eldari privateers who had spent decades fighting across the galaxy's most dangerous space, and he drove them into the Tyranid biofleet surrounding Iandan, with the controlled fury of a commander who understands the difference between a tactical charge and a suicidal one. As an admiral without peer among the Eldari, Iriel's arrival changed the character of the space battle entirely. His ships hit the biofleet in their most vulnerable formation, and the combination of his fresh forces with the surviving Iandan vessels finally tore the heart out of the Tyranid fleet in orbit. The battle for the Craftworld's interior continued, but with the orbital fleet decisively engaged, the flow of reinforcements to the ground battle was interrupted. The defenders pushed back. The fighting was brutal and constant, and cost Iandan enormously, but the tide turned. When the last Tyranid organism on Iandan was finally located and destroyed, or when the ghost warriors could finally rest and the living could finally breathe, the Craftworld took stock of what it had survived. 4/5 of Iandan's population were dead, not wounded or displaced or traumatized. Dead. The Craftworld that had once been one of the most populous and culturally rich in existence was a ghost ship by the end of the battle, its halls quiet with an absence that pressed against the walls like physical weight. The ghost warriors outnumbered the living now, which was in its own particular way the most Eldari possible outcome to a tragedy. Iriel had saved Iandan, but what he had saved was a shell of the thing it had been. Meanwhile, on the Imperial front of the Second Tyrannic War, another Kraken tendril had descended on the world of Ichar 4. Ichar 4 was a major hive world, densely populated, heavily defended, and strategically critical to the Imperial position in that region of space. The Genestealer cult. Infestation there had been progressing for years, the hidden cancer working through the population in the way such infiltrations always do, quietly and patiently and thoroughly. When Kraken arrived, the cult rose up, attempting to destabilize the planet's defenses from within. At the same moment, the swarm struck from without. It was the doctrine of the hive mind made operationally visible. Weaken from inside while you strike from outside. Marneus Calgar was there. The chapter master of the Ultramarines, veteran of Macragge, bearer of those old wounds in body, and perhaps in whatever sense Space Marines carry grief, was there with his chapter and allies to meet the Tyranids for the second time. Yet he brought to Ishar IV the knowledge bought at such terrible price at Macragge, the tactical understanding of how the swarm operated, where its weaknesses were, how to target the synapse creatures whose destruction sent lesser bioforms into confused, poorly coordinated states. He brought 200 years of the Imperium's accumulated learning about Tyranid warfare, and he brought himself, a fact that mattered at the climactic moment when the Swarm Lord appeared again. The Swarm Lord is the hive mind's greatest servant, the apex of its tactical intelligence given physical form. It is reborn when it dies, the hive mind recreating it from the absorbed memories of its defeat, making it harder to kill the second time because it now knows exactly how it died the first time. At Macragge, as the Swarm Lord had driven Calgar from the battlefield by wounding him near to death. At Ishar IV, Calgar faced the creature again with 2 centuries of preparation for the encounter and a fury that the intervening years had not dimmed. He killed it. Calgar personally defeated the Swarm Lord in close combat, and without the Swarm Lord's directing intelligence, the Tyranid forces on Ishar IV lost the cunning that had been making them so effective and reverted to the more manageable pattern of brute force mass assault. The swarm was broken. The world was saved, though it lay in ruins. The Second Tyrannic War was effectively decided, though at a cost that the Imperium would be counting for years. Our Section 10, What First Contact Revealed, the terrifying truth and its implications. The period from 745 to roughly 994 of the 41st millennium, from the fall of Tyran Primus through the end of the Second Tyrannic War, represents humanity's initiation into the reality of the Tyranid threat. It is a learning process measured in billions of dead. What was learned, and what those lessons implied, is the part of this story that sits with you long after the battles have been recounted. The first and perhaps most important thing that First Contact revealed was the nature of the threat itself. The Tyranids were not, as every other alien species humanity had encountered had been, something that could be engaged on a level of mutual recognition. Every other enemy the Imperium had fought, even the most alien, even the most hostile, was doing something recognizable. The Orcs were warlike and territorial and sought combat as an end in itself. The Necrons were possessive and ancient and wanted to reclaim what they considered their domain. The Aeldari were calculating and sorrowful and trying to manage their species' survival with the instruments of prophecy and manipulation. Even chaos, that force of absolute spiritual corruption, was motivated by things that had their root in recognizable psychology, in the amplified extremes of human emotion and desire. The Tyranids wanted to eat everything. That was the entirety of their intention, not as a metaphor for conquest or domination, or the satisfaction of destruction. Literally, every molecule of biological material, every microorganism, every person, every tree, every blade of grass, every bacterium in the soil, every drop of water containing biological chemistry, all of it consumed and processed and turned into more Tyranids. There was no negotiation possible with this. There was no deterrence, because the Tyranids did not have the concept of deterrence, did not engage in the strategic calculations that deterrence requires. There was no territory to threaten that the Tyranids valued, because the only thing the Tyranids valued was biomass, and they were perfectly willing to lose their own in enormous quantities to get it. The entire framework of strategic thinking that the Imperium had developed over 10,000 years of warfare was applicable to fighting the Tyranids in the immediate tactical sense of one army trying to prevent another from achieving its objectives. Yet it was completely inapplicable in the larger strategic sense of trying to manage a threat through something other than its total destruction. The second thing that First Contact revealed was the true scale of the threat, and this one is genuinely difficult to sit with. Hive Fleet Behemoth, that devastating force that had consumed dozens of worlds, overwhelmed the combined orbital defenses of Macragge and destroyed the entire First Company of the Ultramarines, was small. Not small by any conventional measure of destructive capability, obviously, but small in the sense that mattered. Small relative to the total force of the Tyranid species. Small relative to what was still out there. The Magos biologists, those Adeptus Mechanicus specialists tasked with understanding Tyranid biology and strategy, Phil came to a conclusion after analyzing everything the First and Second Tyrannic Wars had produced, and that conclusion was deeply uncomfortable. The hive fleets that had arrived so far, the ones responsible for all the devastation, all the dead worlds, all the shattered chapters and consumed civilizations and cost in lives beyond any reasonable tally, were not the main body of the Tyranid species. They were advance elements, scouting forces, the equivalent of what a military planner might call deep reconnaissance, sent ahead to identify targets, assess resistance, and send back genetic and tactical information about the local conditions. Inquisitor Kryptman, who spent decades thinking about almost nothing else, put the conclusion plainly in one of his reports. The hive fleets represent only the smallest fraction of the total Tyranid presence in the intergalactic void. The rest of them, the vast majority of the species, are still out there, still moving, still coming. The psychic beacon of the Astronomicon is still burning, still calling them. And every victory the Imperium wins teaches the hive mind something about how to overcome the galaxy's defenses the next time. This is the existential weight of First Contact with the Tyranids. It is not simply that humanity encountered a dangerous alien species and fought it and won, or mostly won, at great cost. It is that humanity encountered the leading edge of something so large that the full scope of it is genuinely incomprehensible. Something that has possibly consumed multiple galaxies before arriving at this one. Something that is patient and adaptive, and has trillions of bodies to spend in the acquisition of knowledge, and that the victories won so far have done nothing to stop that progression. They have slowed individual fleets. They have preserved individual worlds. They have bought time. But the fleets that have been named and fought, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, Gorgon, Hydra, Jormungandr, and all the others, are drops in an ocean of biological darkness that stretches back through the intergalactic void to wherever this thing ultimately comes from. And that ocean is still moving toward the shore. The third thing that First Contact revealed was perhaps the most quietly disturbing of all, because it was a discovery about the Imperium itself, rather than about the Tyranids. The discovery was that the Emperor's great work, the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes human civilization across the galaxy possible, that connects 1,000,000 worlds into something like a coherent civilization, is also the thing that is drawing the Tyranids in. The light that allows the Imperium to exist is the same light that acts as a signal flare into the intergalactic dark, announcing the presence of an enormous wealth of biological material to something that processes such information as an invitation to dinner. This is a trap with no clean exit. Turn off the Astronomicon, and the Imperium collapses, its ships unable to navigate, its worlds isolated, its military unable to coordinate at anything beyond local scale. Leave the Astronomicon burning, and it continues to call things in from the dark. Yet the Imperium exists in a state of structural vulnerability to the Tyranid threat that cannot be resolved by any conventional military victory, however significant. Every battle won and every fleet destroyed is followed by the same Astronomicon continuing to burn, and the same void continuing to contain whatever is still making its way toward the galaxy in response to that light. There is a word that appears in the classified strategic assessments of the Ordo Xenos, redacted from public documents, visible only to those with the clearance to read them. The word is inevitable, not as a counsel of despair or a surrender of will, as an assessment of the mathematical reality of the situation, a recognition that the Tyranid threat cannot be ended in the conventional sense of destroying an enemy. It can only be managed, delayed, and fought, while world by world, fleet by fleet, until either the Imperium finds some way to change the fundamental terms of the conflict, or it doesn't. And yet the Imperium fights, the Space Marines go to war, the Guard bleeds across 100 front lines simultaneously. The Inquisition watches and plans, and sometimes makes decisions that are terrible in their logic and sound in their mathematics. The tyrannic war veterans, that legacy of Chaplain Cassius's understanding after Macragge, carry the knowledge of how to fight the swarm forward into each new generation of warriors. The galaxy does not surrender simply because the assessment is difficult. It endures, as it always has, and pays the price that endurance requires. The contact that began on Tyran Primus in 745 of the 41st millennium has never really ended. It is ongoing right now, as in 1,000 places across the eastern fringe and beyond. The swarm is always somewhere, always eating, always learning, always adapting. Every day that the Imperium survives is a day that the men and women who stand in the path of the great devourer have held the line. And perhaps that is, in the grim darkness of this far future, something worth sitting with. Not victory, which may be too much to ask for, but survival, resistance, the stubborn insistence of something living in the face of something that wants only to consume it. The Tyranids came, and the galaxy learned what it was dealing with. The galaxy did not fold. It learned, as the Tyranids learned, and it changed, and it continued to fight. That is, in the 41st millennium, what hope looks like. Closing. So there it is. The full story of when humanity first made contact with the Tyranids, from the silent warning of the pharaohs in the age of the Horus heresy, through the dead worlds and the desperate investigations of Inquisitor Cryptman, through the fall of Tyran Primus and the terrible defense of Macragge, and the long recovery and the second wave with Hive Fleet Kraken, and finally through the broader understanding of what that contact actually means in the cosmic scope of the 41st millennium. What strikes me every time I come back to this lore is the sheer weight of what those first defenders were carrying. Magos Varnak, in his final moments, choosing to preserve data over attempting survival because the data was what mattered, and he knew it. Cryptman, standing on a scoured dead world, building in his mind the picture of something so vast and terrible that the proper response was probably despair, and choosing action instead. Calgar, standing under a white marble portico, listening to a briefing that would have shaken anyone, and immediately beginning to plan. The Tyranids represent something that Warhammer 40,000 does better than almost any other science fiction setting, which is the encounter with something genuinely, irreducibly alien. Not alien in the sense of strange or exotic, alien in the sense of being so fundamentally other that every framework you have for understanding doesn't apply, and then showing you what people do in the face of that, what they choose, how they carry it. The answer, in 40K, is that they carry it very badly and very bravely and at enormous cost, and they keep going anyway. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that's the kind of story that keeps me coming back to this universe, again and again. The darkness is real, and it's enormous, and somehow people persist in it. That persistence, that stubborn refusal to stop, is what first contact with the Tyranids really shows us. Not just what the swarm is, but what humanity is when the swarm arrives. If this video helped you understand the Tyranids and their place in the 40K universe a little better, or if it just gave you something quiet and interesting to sit with today, it would mean a great deal if you could hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want to hear these stories told this way. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. There are more stories in this universe, more moments of terrible beauty and quiet heroism and cosmic darkness, and I want to tell all of them. Thank you for watching. Rest well.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.